Brian David Cook was a 37-year-old from Oceana, West Virginia. He was a military vet and a father. On July 26, 2011, Brian got picked up at his girlfriend's house so he could buy a truck from his stepmother. He allegedly got to this destination but didn't buy the truck, then left. He was never seen again. I'm Ed Denzel, and this is Unfound. Is it me, or does it seem octopuses, or more appropriately, octopi, are in the news a lot these days? On YouTube, it seems so many of the recommended videos are an octopus opening a jar, an octopus slipping through an opening that looks too small for its large head, an octopus moving from one type of coral to another, changing colors multiple times to blend in with its surroundings. And don't even get me started regarding that story from last year that said octopi might be from another planet. Yes, really. Why am I talking about this one-of-a-kind invertebrate? Well, almost 30 years ago, there was an alleged conspiracy that was centered in West Virginia, where Unfound is today. And the reporter who had been following the leads in that conspiracy had called it, yes, you guessed it, the octopus, because of all the arms or tentacles his investigation had allegedly uncovered. You can look it up. Danny Casolaro was his name, and he ended up committing suicide. Allegedly. Well, with Brian Cook, although I don't believe his case is linked to the octopus, his disappearance may not be one that stands alone. Because in the summer of 2011, a woman he most likely knew went missing right after Brian from the same town. And two other people in the same drug circles Brian ran in were murdered. Their cases are still unsolved. Once again, during the summer of 2011. It could be Brian's disappearance may be part of a large crime spree extending even before and after that summer. And his missing persons case is just the tip of the tentacle. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Good's site, Charley Project. Brian Cook was a military vet, serving his country with distinction, and he left the armed forces to become a welder, spending many days away from home for work. He got married and had a daughter. Everything seemed to be well on its way, but in the early 2000s, while on the road, Brian developed a heroin habit that gradually began to dismantle his life. Before anyone knew it, he was using drugs at home. He spent some time in jail, and his wife and daughter left him. Although Brian was in the fight of his life, he never missed calling his daughter daily. But due to his troubles, he had to move back to his father's state of West Virginia. It was there he got a new girlfriend, although the drug use continued. Adding to this already tough life, Brian's father died not long before Brian disappeared. But on July 26, 2011, Brian had a plan. He had some cash he had received from his father's death. Brian wanted to buy a truck off of his stepmother. All he had to do was get a ride to Van, West Virginia, not far away, and they could seal the deal. He enlisted a man he knew, Maurice McKenzie, to drive him there. They made it to Van, but the stepmother refused to sell Brian the truck, allegedly because he was drunk. She told him to come back the next day. Maurice then drove Brian back to Lincoln, West Virginia, where he dropped Brian off at the post office. Brian was never seen again. The summer of 2011 was a violent time for Wyoming and Boone County in West Virginia. 2 adults missing, Brian Cook and Sherry Myers, and 2 others murdered, Rachel Toller and Chester Stewart. All 4 either knew each other or had connections to a group of people with extensive criminal records who have never been charged with any crimes in any of these cases. Yet specifically for Brian's case, these major questions remain. Number 1, why would Brian request to be dropped off at a post office in Lincoln, West Virginia? Number 2, how did the lockbox Brian owned end up in a burned-out truck owned by Maurice? And number 3, could an alleged sighting of Brian with 2 men at a convenience store solve not only his case, but the others as well? Since Brian's disappearance, there have been many rumors and a lot of erroneous information that has continued right up to the recording of this episode. Brian's family believes he met with foul play on July 26th, 2011. My guest today is Brian's ex-wife, Christine Long. Unfound News. It's the last Friday of June, so you know what that means. You can expect an Unfound newsletter before the next episode comes out. If you'd like to receive this monthly publication, please contact me at unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. Next, Unfound Now debuted this past week. Yes, it took a little while because I had to wait for a disappearance to make national news. That disappearance ended up being an 18-year-old Amish woman from Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania, Linda Stoltfus. She went missing while walking home from a church function on June 21st. If you'd like to hear what I had to say, please go to the Unfound podcast channel on YouTube. Finally, I got to speak to the mother of Zoe Campos this past week. Melinda told me that Carlos Rodriguez's trial was supposed to start in May 2020. However, it got pushed to 2021 due to COVID-19. Carlos has decided to plead not guilty. Unfound will keep you updated once the trial starts. Where you can find Unfound. Unfound supports accounts on Podomatic, iTunes, Stitcher, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, Deezer, and Facebook. On Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, please join us on the Unfound podcast channel on YouTube for the Unfound live show. All of you can talk with me, and I can answer your questions. Contribute to Unfound at patreon.com/unfoundpodcast. This week, I need to thank Amanda. You can also contribute at PayPal, paypal.me/unfoundpodcast. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the ex-wife of Brian Cook, Christine Long. Christine, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you so much, Ed. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
You're very welcome. This is what we do at Unfound. The listeners should know that I've known Christine for a couple years now, probably sometime in 2018, and so I'm very happy to finally have her on the program. Christine, why don't you tell the listeners just a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into how you met Brian, etc.
Sure. There's nothing terribly exciting about my life. I'm the wife of a person who serves in our military. I've got 2 kids, and all of their friends are like my children as well. And we just move around frequently, and because of the military, and this just happens to be part of my life story. That's all.
Okay. And when you say 2 kids, one of those children being Brian's?
Yes, Brian and I have a daughter together. She's 20, and then I have a son who's 13, and he is from my current marriage. Okay, great. Okay, thank you for that. So let's start right here. How did you and Brian meet? We know that he disappeared in West Virginia. Is that where you 2 met, or did you meet somewhere else? How did that all happen? No, Brian was born in West Virginia, and he couldn't wait to get out. So when he turned 18, he signed up for the Marine Corps, and he served 6 years in the Marine Corps and ended up at Quantico in Virginia. And I'm from Northern Virginia, and some friends and I used to go to this dance club on Saturdays. On one side, they had country music, and on the other side, they had dance music, and we liked both. And so we would hang out there on Saturdays, and his friends actually came up to me and my friend to talk to us, and we were really disinterested. And so we lied and said we didn't speak English. And
I had that pulled on me
later
once. No, I'm kidding.
And then a little later on, he came up and started talking, and his friends were trying to tell him not to bother because we didn't speak English, but he was cute. and he smelled good, and he asked me to dance, and I said yes. And so that's how we met. We met at a place called Blackie's in Alexandria.
Alexandria, Virginia. Wow. What year was that?
1995.
Wow. Seems like yesterday.
I actually was looking up Blackie's the other day to get ready for the interview, and I realized that it was actually a steakhouse during the day, so I guess they turned it into a nightclub after 9 o'clock, but it was a steakhouse during the day.
And you didn't even know that at the time?
No, I probably did know then, but it was a piece of information that had long been forgotten.
Okay. All right, 1995, and listeners should know, I would never say a guess age, but Christine and I are close in age, so that sounds about right. Country and dance put together in 1995. That almost makes sense. That kind of made sense back then. Okay. So you got to know Brian this way. Did he or does he have any brothers and sisters? Did you, of course, we know you eventually got married, but did you get introduced to other people in his family eventually during that time?
Yeah, we actually didn't talk he gave me his telephone number, but he gave me the number of a payphone outside of his barracks room. And I didn't know his last name. So when I called, they were like, Brian who? And I didn't know his name. So I didn't talk to him for months. And I guess one day he was cleaning out his wallet and found my number and called. It was probably another 6 months before he called to say, hey, remember me?
Wow.
And I was living in Richmond by that time, and he came and stayed the weekend, and then he just never left. And so after that, I did get to meet his mom. He has a brother with special needs. His name is Gregory, and he's like the greatest person ever. And then he's got a half-brother, Matthew. So Brian's father and mother divorced when he was 14, and then his dad got remarried, and his little brother, Matthew, is the product of that marriage.
Okay. All right. And Brian is where was his family from? Were they from the Virginia area, or where was he from?
He was from Boone County, West Virginia, and all his family is from Boone County, West Virginia as well.
Okay. All right, so you two first met in 1995, but it took some months before you got back in contact with each other. How long was it before you two got married?
We got married in 1998. He was 24 and I was 25, and I had bought a townhouse, and so we lived with our 2 dogs in the townhouse in Richmond, Virginia. And then he was ready for us to settle down. We were still drinking on the weekends and having a good time and partying like we were teenagers, and he thought it was time for me to settle down, so he switched the birth control pills that I was taking to the sugar pills, and found out not too long after that I was pregnant with Macy.
Is that right? That's how that happened.
That is how that happened.
How did you feel about that, Christine? That seems like a very underhanded thing to do.
It seemed like a very Brian thing to do. I wasn't thrilled about it. I wasn't ever planning on having kids, and he knew that. But
wow.
I think once I found out I was pregnant with her, I just knew right away that she was going to be the love of my life, and it's true. It's been that way ever since.
And so your daughter, who is 20 now, 20 years old?
Yes.
So she was born in 2000 or 1999?
She was. Yep, she was born 3/11/2000.
Wow. And that's how that happened. Wow. Okay. Well, I have to admit, I think for most of us, I think we've heard about women skipping their birth control pills. You know, we hear about that, but this is the first time where I heard the guy switch to birth control pills. That's a first.
Brian loved kids. He loved kids like I have never seen a man love kids like this man loved kids. So he was ready to be a dad. I just was never ready to be a mom.
Okay. Wow. Okay. And so during that time, maybe before the year 2000, what were you doing for work, and what was he doing for work?
So I initially moved to Richmond to be a nanny. And the people who I was going to nanny for had an apartment over their garage, and it was pretty spiffy, and I was very excited about moving out and having my own place. But the kid was a spoiled brat, and I didn't feel like it was a good fit after I moved down there. So I moved out not 2 weeks later and found a job through a temp agency with the county of Henrico, and I used to go into the jails and interview people who had been picked up the night before for nonviolent offenses, and just see if they would be a good candidate for the program I worked for, which was pretrial services.
Wow. Okay. And what was Brian doing? Was he still in the military, or what was he doing by that time?
He was still in the military. I think he got out of the military, let's say, by the time we got married. So by the time we had Macy, he was out of the military, and he had been working as an apprentice Boilermaker for a year by that time. Okay. And we ended up moving out of our townhouse and bought a house on the north side of Richmond.
Okay. Now, we're going to maybe have to explain that. What exactly is a Boilermaker?
Yeah, I wish that I could explain it, but basically what he did was put on a lot of silly clothes to keep him from getting burnt, and he welded big, huge boilers. I don't know any more than that. He used to go away, and he welded all day long, and he loved it, and then he would come home, and that was that. So I don't really know exactly I know it was more advanced than that. He had to test to get to every job that he was on, so he had to be good at it in order to get the job. All right, so generally a welder. And yes, basically, yes. And I'm sure there's listeners right now who are saying, "What do you mean? You two don't know what a Boilermaker is?" I think of course like Purdue Boilermakers, which is their nickname, the college's nickname. I think sure. It's the drink, a Boilermaker, but an actual job, that's not something I've run across. So. Boilermaker, we're just going to dismiss it as generally as being a welder. Okay. So then you two get married. You have your daughter Macy in 2000. Yep. Now, when would you say, we know that he disappeared in 2011. We know that you are his ex-wife. You were divorced before he went missing. What happened? What happened in the 2000s that led to your divorce? Sure. When Macy was 3, so it would be around 2003, I found a Coke can that had been smashed and turned into something he could smoke weed out of. And so I didn't make a big stink about it, but I just asked him if he had started smoking pot, and he said once in a while he did it. So it wasn't a huge deal. But he would go away for work a lot and come back, and I didn't get to see his daily behavior. It wasn't something I could catch on to quickly. Mm-hmm. And I had never really been around anybody who had been doing drugs, so I just assumed he was smoking pot every now and again, and that wasn't a huge deal for me. And he came home one time and was fixing his truck in the garage, and I went out there, and he was like unconscious under his truck, and I couldn't figure out what had happened. Called the police. The ambulance came, got him, took him to the hospital. When I get to the hospital, they said something about him having overdosed on heroin. And I thought, well, that's a mistake because he doesn't do heroin. So I just dismissed it because I didn't believe it. And when I asked him about it, of course, he lied about it. Yeah. But as time went on, I realized that it was getting worse and that it was indeed heroin. And when I asked him about it, he said the last time he had gone away, he went to smoke pot, and somebody had laced it with heroin, and the first time was the best time, and he was chasing that high ever since. And like as any drug addict does, they try to find the best ways to get high, and eventually he did turn to needles, and I just couldn't. Yeah. I was afraid for my health. Right. And right. For Macy's health, sure. We had gotten a letter from the VA saying that he needed to attend a seminar on hepatitis, and so they clearly knew before I did how far gone he was. And so once I found out that it was that bad, I went back to work and tried to afford for him to go to rehab. And he did go 3 times. He stayed once for almost 60 days, once for just under 30 days, and then he couldn't even make it 3 days the last time. Wow. And so at that point, he was doing things. He was doing things that were getting him in trouble. He wasn't being careful anymore. He was. I got a call from the police that I needed to come pick his truck up because he had been arrested for possession And
Wow.
when I went to go pick his truck up, he had driven to the worst part of Richmond I had never even known existed. And I had to go there with my daughter, who was 3. And at that point, I just said, I need to do something about this. I need to get out of this. And so.
Right.
Go ahead.
So I was going to say, so this all happened in 2003, or how long of a time span? You said that in 2003, you found out about the weed, but then it went to heroin. How long was this rehab and everything? Over what span of time was all of this?
It was just about a year. I was willing to try and stick it out with him while he tried to get well. And then I realized I made him dinner one night. He had gotten out of jail. His mom paid his bail to get out, so he came home. And he'd gotten out of jail, and I made dinner, and he had fallen into his mashed potatoes, and Macy thought it was funny. And I thought, she's only going to think that's funny for so long. I've got to get her out of here. So, and so that's what happened. He had to go to jail eventually when he went back to court for that charge. He had to spend time in jail, and while he was in jail, I put our house up for sale and moved in with some friends that lived down in Hampton.
Wow. Could you, in meeting Brian, once again, we now know how you two met way back in 1995. Could you have ever suspected that things would go that way?
Oh, not even a little bit. I swear, he would do. Sometimes he worked in town, and there was a lot of work in town, in fact. And while he was working in town, he would sometimes work 12 and 16 hours, and he would come home. And he would take a shower to get all that stuff off of him. And the first thing he would do was pick Macy up and take her outside. They would go on nature walks, or he would take her fishing, or there was just never, he just was all about Macy. And I just never would have thought that he would do anything that would keep him from being with her. So it was a big surprise.
How do you, now, all these years later, of course we know that he's still missing here in 2020, but how do you look at that time now? This is something like a mistake, or was this just something he's on the road and a little undisciplined? He didn't have you around to kind of keep an eye on. What do you think?
I think that sometimes people have addictive behaviors, and he's one. Mm-hmm. He comes from a family of people with addictive, and I think the high from heroin felt so good that he was just instantly addicted. And given the choice between us and it, which I gave him too many times, he always chose heroin. Wow. And I just couldn't, I couldn't see it. At first, I used to say to him, you've got to make a choice, you've got to make a choice. And finally it dawned on me that he had made the choice, but I just hadn't followed through with what I was saying.
Right.
And so I just had to go. And so I don't look at it as I don't think he knew. I'll be honest, I don't think he knew when he took that hit of pot that it was laced with heroin.
Okay. And these rehab stints, do you think that was this just him going through the motions of going to rehab, or do you think that he was really trying to? I mean, we hear a lot about rehab on Unfound. We talk a lot about drugs and addiction. A lot of people go and it works, and a lot of people go and it doesn't work. Do you think he was trying, or was he just doing it to make you happy?
I think he was hoping that it would work, but I think more than that, he was hoping it would look good to the courts that he tried.
Okay.
That's what I would guess. By that time, he was just, if I had caught it earlier, maybe I could have helped him more. I don't like to think about that because then it puts some onus on me, and it really was his issue. It wasn't my issue.
Yeah.
And I just didn't know enough. I had never been around. I've been around alcoholics, but I had never really been around any drugs, like hard drugs like that. So I just didn't know what to look for. And I would like to think that I could have helped him if I had known sooner. But but he followed his own path. He
Right.
made choices too.
Okay. Now, then, of course, you two did end up getting divorced. How did he, you moved out, and everything. How did he handle when you said, hey, I'm out of here? Me and Macy are out of here.
I sort of did the cowardly thing, I'll be honest. I sold the house while he was in jail, and I didn't tell him we were leaving right away. once I sold the house, I sent him a letter in jail that said we left. And I, of course, let him know where we were. I have a daughter with him. He definitely deserves to know where she's at.
Yeah.
So I let him know. And I made sure he wasn't, going to be destitute and homeless when he came out. I set up a bank account for him with half the money from the house in it so that he could find his own way, and it was plenty that he could get an apartment or move in with a roommate or something. So I did that, and he would just write us letter after letter. I think he was in jail. I honestly can't remember how long. I'm sure any background that you did, you probably found it more factual than my brain. But he was in jail for several months the first time, I think, and during that time he just kept sending letters that said he hopes we could get back together and he loves us and he'll never stop loving us. And I would write back and say that I love him too, but I need him to be well or I can't be around him.
Yeah.
And so we just went on like that probably a while. We went on like that for a while. I still love him today as much as I did when we were married. So, but we got divorced because he wanted to marry someone else eventually. It took a very long time for him to decide that we were not going to get back together.
Okay. When did you two get divorced? What year?
2011.
Wow.
We got divorced before he went missing.
So, just so I understand this correctly, you found this out in 2003. You moved out sometime in 2004, and it took 7 years to get divorced.
Yeah, for a little while it was because he wasn't well, and I couldn't find, he didn't have an address, so I couldn't have him served. Wow. And then for a little while it was, I wasn't trying to move on really to be with anybody else on that level, so it didn't matter if we were divorced or not. I actually 3 years later met my current husband, and we were dating, and I was moving on with life. After I met my husband, I had my son. We didn't get married until after Brian went missing.
Wow.
So
okay.
My son was 5 years old when Brian went missing.
Okay.
And so we still weren't divorced, and so neither one of us wanted to really put an end to it.
It was hard to say totally goodbye. It was like 99% goodbye, but it wasn't 100% goodbye. It was difficult.
It was. In fact, the day that he decided to file, and so he went to court for our divorce, and on the day that he went, he called me, and we just sat on the phone crying, bawling our heads off over it. It's just a horrible thing to go through.
Right. So this happened. He did disappear, once again, July 2011, and that divorce happened earlier that year.
Yes, it happened earlier that year.
Okay. Do you have any idea, being that you weren't around him for most of the rest of the 2000s, between, let's just pick 2005 and 2011, do you know what he was doing? Was he able to work? Where was he living? You said sometimes you couldn't find him. Did he go back into his family, to his parents? Any idea what he was doing in those years?
Oh, yeah. He called us every day. Every single day, no matter what situation he was in, he would call and talk to me and Macy just to say hi and see what we're doing and tell us that he loves us. So I always knew where he was. I just wasn't always he wasn't always there for very long. So I couldn't have him served with anything. Yeah. But I did always know where he was. He did go back to West Virginia for a time. His mother lives in Alabama. He stayed with her for a time. He was dating someone who was from southwestern Virginia, and she agreed to uproot her kids and move to Virginia Beach. So they lived where we lived for about 3 years. He stayed with my parents for probably 2 months. He got a job at this place in Portsmouth that had an apartment attached to the shop, the welding shop, and so they let him stay there in return for working and paying him a smaller wage. So he was still in town for a while. I don't know. He always found someone or a place to be. but he was still always using or drunk or something. He was rarely sober.
Did you see him at all? Did you allow Macy to see him? Did he make any attempts to come see you during those years or not?
Oh yeah, he still remained somebody that I considered like a great friend. And when he wasn't in jail and he was sober enough, he was always welcome. He could come over and eat dinner with my family and put Macy to bed if he wanted to. He just needed to be sober when he came over. And so he got to see a lot of Macy. I know I'll be judged for that, but she was his everything and he was her everything. And I just feel like if he and I can still, be mature adults, that she deserves every chance at being able to have as close to both of her parents as possible.
Right.
So we did a lot of back and forth. There was a time where I would let her even spend the night over at his house once or twice. But then his girlfriend got really jealous about how much he paid attention to Macy, and so she would cause a big stink, and then he would call me to come pick her up. So there was never really a successful overnight, but we did try. Okay. I don't know. I wanted him to be a part of her life as much as possible, but I did have to be careful.
Of course. Okay. So you said he was with a particular woman, and she had some children, and they were in Virginia Beach for a while. Do you remember the first time that you heard about a woman, Alicia Toth?
Yes, I remember.
Let's talk about that. We're just going to talk about her in general from now. She's going to play a role later, but what can you tell listeners what you knew about her at the time, before he disappeared?
Yep, he called and said that he had met someone, that he actually had known her from before he met me, and that she had been asking at his dad's house for how to get in touch with Brian. And when he moved back to West Virginia, his dad was real sick with black lung, and when he moved back to West Virginia, his dad told him that this girl was looking for him, and he found a way to get in touch with her. He introduced her to me by a different name. But
and what was that name? And what was that name?
Alicia White.
Alicia White. Okay.
Yep. And so he introduced me to her as Alicia White, and they would call every day to say, like he always did, to talk to Macy or to me. And she would get on the phone and try to talk to Macy and to try and talk to me. But she had this I don't know how to express how I felt about her. I didn't feel any kind of jealousy whatsoever, but she had this very sticky, sweet Southern accent that was just too,
the
sweet. Amount of kindness that she showed was just so fake that I just didn't believe it for a minute. And so he and I would sort of laugh about how she tried to talk to me nicely and how I didn't buy it for a minute. Like, he wasn't trying to convince me that she was who she was pretending to be. He just laughed with me like he knew she was acting as well.
Okay. And where did they meet? What, if you were to say a town in West Virginia, where did he meet her? What area is this?
She lived in Oceana, West Virginia.
Okay.
And so and they ended up living in Oceana together, so I'm gonna guess that he went there to meet her.
Okay.
Once he found out she was looking for him.
Did you ever meet her before he disappeared? Did you ever meet her before he disappeared?
Not in person. I've never met her in person.
Ever.
We've only ever spoken on the phone.
Okay, so to this day you've never met her in person?
No, nope.
Okay. So he knew her from way back, early 90s, maybe into the 80s, like you said before. He met you, and then they kind of reestablished things after he broke up with this other woman from Virginia Beach.
Right.
Okay. All right. So, and that's, he and Alicia were a couple when he disappeared? They were an item?
They were, yes.
Okay. We'll just leave it at that for now, but she's going to play a role later. You had brought up that this house money, you had sold the house, and I guess he had gotten half of it, whatever the profit was from the house. Do you know what he did with that money? Do you know if he blew it all on drugs? What did he do with it?
I'm going to bet the first thing he did was get high, but after that he started thinking about what he was going to need to do, and he bought a car.
Okay.
He had the car exactly 72 hours, and then he crashed the car into a brick building.
Oh, my.
He broke almost all of the bones in his actual body, except his skull, and was in the hospital for 6 weeks. Most of that time he was out of it, but he had to have surgery on both of his arms and one of his legs, and he had rods and pins in both. And that even though we told the doctors he was a drug addict, they prescribed him OxyContin. So when he got out, he was still addicted, and no one in his family was willing to come and take care of him once insurance decided his hospital stay needed to be over, and he couldn't walk, and he couldn't take care of himself. So I think maybe stupidly, I moved back to Richmond, and we rented a house for 3 or 4 months while I took care of him.
And what year was this?
Oh, I'm going to say 2004. At the end of it was at the end of 2004 because it's been Christmas in that house.
Okay. All right, so that certainly didn't help his drug addiction, getting into this wreck and having to take pain medication, etc.
No, it didn't, and I thought that I was doing a good job of keeping his medicine out of the way, but he wanted to get out of the house one day, and he wanted to go to this place called Southern States, where I guess they sell horse medicine, and I don't know. Anyway, we went there, and he stole, I didn't know this, but he stole a syringe and some ketamine. And when we got home, he said he was tired and wanted to take a nap, so I took Macy upstairs and let him get some rest. And I thought I heard him knock on the wall like, hey, I need some help. And when I went downstairs, he had his arm wrapped up and a needle in his arm and blood all over the sheets.
Oh, man.
So I picked him up and I put him in his wheelchair and I wheeled him out to the back deck and I closed the door because if I had to look at him another minute, I probably would have done something I would have ended up in jail for myself.
Okay, I can understand that. But do you, all right, so he gets in this wreck. Do you think he wrecked because he was high or something? Fell asleep at the wheel?
Oh, he absolutely wrecked because he was high. Yeah, he hit the building at 45 miles an hour, and when the car stopped, he got out and walked, even though most of his body was broken. He walked a good couple of feet and then sat down on the curb and waited for somebody to come.
Oh my gosh.
So the doctors told me he had a good bit of heroin in his system when they picked him up.
Okay. Wow. And this money, was any of it left by the time 2011 rolled around or not, to your knowledge?
Oh, I would guess by 2011, no way.
Okay.
No way. He wasted it within 6 months.
Okay. All right, so we're moving up here now to 2011. To remind the listeners that this is the year that you finally did get divorced from him. This is the year that he disappeared. Let's talk about this. Brian's father died in 2011.
Yeah, just 2 weeks before Brian went missing.
And how would you say Brian handled it? If you were in contact with him, how did he handle that?
He was devastated. His dad was very sick, and he was on medication. He'd been a coal miner his whole life and had black lung. And he had just gotten married to his second wife's sister.
Wow.
And she was dealing out his medicine each day, and I guess she found him one day non-responsive, and so he passed away. And so Brian was devastated. He really idolized his father, and he worked. His dad was a hard worker, and Brian was also a hard worker, and he really valued that in his dad. So he called me and said that his dad had died, and he went on talking as if I was automatically going to come up for the funeral, and I really wasn't interested in having Macy come up with me, and I didn't have anywhere for her to be, so we didn't go to the funeral.
Okay.
But I know that he suspected that there was some foul play involved in his dad's death, and
that the new wife kind of pushed it along a little bit.
Yeah, that's what he thinks. In fact, he's in the stuff that I got back after his mom went to go pick up all of his stuff after he went missing at Alicia's house, and in the stuff that I found were baggies full of pieces of hair, and one was labeled his dad's chest hair, and one was labeled his dad's head hair. And so I'm going to guess that he was going to try to get it tested to see if he'd been overdosed.
Wow. Okay. Just so we're clear, how long was his father married to this woman before he died?
I don't know exact date that he got married, but it was a very short period of time. I would say between 3 and 6 months.
Okay. Well, I can see maybe why Brian suspected that, but we just don't know. Of course, coal miners, like you said,
alleged. It's definitely alleged.
Just alleged. Okay. So his father dies. Does Brian get anything from his father? Any life insurance, anything like that?
He is still able to collect some life insurance. I guess there's a coal miner's burial fund that he can get money from if he were still alive. But his dad did have cash in a bank, and that money went right to Brian.
All right. And is that the cash that we're eventually going to talk about regarding the day of his disappearance?
Yes.
Okay. And how much was that?
It was $16,000.
Wow. Okay. All right, so he gets this $16,000 after his father died, which, like you said, is only a few weeks before Brian disappeared on July 28th, 2011. So we'll just pick out a date of like July 14th or maybe July 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, something in there is when his father died. Okay, at the time, did you know that Brian got that money, or is that something you didn't find out until later?
Oh, no, he told me right away.
He told
me right away because he was super excited. He thought for the first time he would be able to buy another car and drive down to Virginia to see Macy.
Okay, and you were living in Virginia at the time?
Yes.
Okay. You look back at it now. When was the last time you spoke to him before he disappeared?
2 days. So July the 26th, I spoke to him.
Okay.
He was supposed to, so he was supposed to go and speak to his father's wife about purchasing his dad's truck from her. And he was so excited. He told me he was going to head that direction, and then he would be at my mom's house, in the next day or so. So that was the last time that I spoke with him.
All right, 2 days before. All right. The way you look back at it now, once again, we're just putting aside that he disappeared on the 28th, anything that seemed out of the ordinary, anything unusual, in your opinion? Did it seem like his drug use was as bad as ever? Once again, I know you weren't seeing him very often, but the way you remember that last conversation or those last few weeks, anything that really stands out to you now?
No, I'm not really any different than what I always knew. His girlfriend that he was with was also a drug addict. That she had a little baby at the time. He was helping her care for the baby. Nothing really. His drug use and hers were, the same level they were when he left. He was just always after the high, and so was she.
Okay. All right, so no, once again, nothing unusual than what you had experienced with him going on maybe 5 or 6 years.
No, nothing very different at all.
Did he tell you about ever, I don't know how much he was confiding in you. You have to remember you were with another man at the time, a man you eventually married. You had another child.
Did he ever say that anybody was after him? Did he ever seem like manic or paranoid? All these times you ever spoke to him, did he say anybody he was having problems with anybody, anything like that?
Yeah, there was a time when they lived in Virginia Beach that he would say stuff like that, but he was with a different woman at that time, and I think I remember him telling me that they were smoking crack, and so those were all just delusions of crack. But not since he was back in West Virginia. He didn't have any fear at all of anybody there. He grew up there. He knew most everybody there. He wasn't somebody who was, he would never let himself be afraid of anything.
Okay. All right, so we now move up. You just said that you spoke to him on July 26th, 2011, and he disappeared on July 28th, 2011. Now, this is going to get a little complex for the listeners because there's the story that's been out there for many years now, and then there is what you've been able to find out recently. And when I say recently, maybe within the last year, year and a half, where a new name has come up, and because you read for example, the Charley Project, run by my friend Megan Good, you get one impression of the disappearance, but eventually we're going to be talking about maybe a different version of events of that day. So for now, Christine, let's just go over what has been on the record since 2011. We're not saying that this story is correct, but this will maybe show us how maybe things have changed over the last 9 years. What were you originally told about that day, and how you found out about it, how you found out that Brian was missing? Maybe you can go through all of that.
Sure. I hadn't heard from him, and like I had said, there was a single day since we broke up that he didn't call. And so he had been in jail before, he had been homeless before. There just was never a time he didn't find a way to call us every single day. So on the 26th, when he said he was going to get his dad's truck and head my way, I expected to see him on the 27th, and I didn't. And not only did I not see him, but I didn't hear from him, which is very odd. So I thought, well, maybe he broke down and he was trying to deal with that, and he just got too busy. I really tried to, just put a little positive spin on it, because he wasn't beholden to call me every day. And I thought if he was with Alicia, she probably wouldn't like that he was trying to call me every day. So,
okay.
So I didn't think too much of it on the 27th. On the 28th, when I still didn't hear from him and he didn't show up, I called Alicia to find out if she had heard from him. And she said she hadn't seen him in 2 days. So I called his mom, and I said, have you heard from Brian? And she said she hadn't heard from him in a week.
Wow.
And so I called Alicia back and told her, you or his mom need to call the police. There's something wrong. And
so just so we're understanding something, Alicia on the 28th is telling you she hasn't seen him since the 26th, the day that you spoke to him.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, even though you spoke to him that day.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Please continue.
So she also reiterated to me that he was going to that he went with a friend of hers to go to his dad's wife's house to try and buy the truck so that he could drive down to see Macy. And so I heard that he went there. And then I heard
How did you hear? If you could say, if you can remember, how did you hear that?
So his wife had told one of his cousins, his dad's wife had told one of his cousins that Brian had shown up.
Okay.
But that he showed up drunk. And that she wasn't going to give him the truck while he was drunk, and told him to come back the next day.
And she's saying this happened on the 28th.
So I'm saying that happened sometime between the 26th and the 28th.
Okay.
Honestly, I think he went missing on the 26th, but it wasn't reported until the 28th.
All right. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So July 28th, in your estimation, what you've learned in the last 9 years might not even be the right day.
Yes,
that
that's
might
correct.
be possibly a date that other people are putting out there to push suspicion away from them onto somebody else.
Yes, and I also think because that's the day that he was reported missing, that's the date they have him as missing from.
Okay.
So it's easy to get confused.
So it very well could be what you're saying then is if you spoke to him on the July 26th, that very well could be the day he disappeared.
I think so because he would have called me. There just is no reason in my mind to believe he wouldn't have called to try and talk to me or to Macy.
Okay. All right, so you find out from a cousin of his that he did show up to his father's house. Of course, his father's already deceased, so his new wife that his father had only been, what's her name? Maybe first name, please, only. What's her name?
To be honest, I can't even remember what her first name
is. Okay.
I know her sister's name, but I can't remember hers.
Okay, we'll just call her the stepmother. The stepmother said that Brian showed up.
Yes.
Okay. Did he show up alone?
No, the stepmother said that he showed up with someone else, that somebody else had driven him.
All right, and who was that person?
His name is Maurice.
All right, so he shows up. Had you ever, when she said that, had you ever heard of Maurice before? Had Brian ever mentioned him at all?
I hadn't heard Maurice's name, but I had heard about Maurice.
Okay. All right, so she's saying that Brian showed up, wanted to buy the truck. He was in no shape to drive, so she didn't sell it to him. What then is the story, once again, the story on the record for the last so many years that happened after that?
So the Oceana police record says that that Maurice drove him to a post office in a town called Linco and dropped him off. And that's the last time anybody saw him alive.
Okay. Did anybody see this? Is there any proof that Brian was ever at that post office? Sometimes post offices have video cameras out front or inside. Could the police ever back up Maurice's story at all?
No. Not even a little bit.
Did Maurice ever say why that was the location? Once again, the way you know Brian, what was going on in his life, does that location have any significance?
No, it's in fact out of the way of things, so it doesn't make any sense to me that he would have been dropped there at all. Okay, so this is Linco, Virginia, West Virginia. And what town was Brian living in at the time? Oceana, West Virginia.
And where, if you can remember, where did the stepmother live?
She lived in either Van or Wharton at the time. I can't remember which town, but they're very near each other.
Okay, so people, if they want to go to Google or someplace else, they can map these things out. And maybe I'll do another map for this episode to help everybody out. So I haven't decided that right at this second. But okay, so they went to Van or Wharton. The stepmother doesn't want to sell him the truck. I have to admit, I'm a little confused why she just didn't give it to him. I mean, it is his father's truck. Selling it seems a bit cold, in my opinion. But then they end up allegedly in Linco. When did you find out about this? That allegedly that he ended up in Linco.
So I heard that story. It was a while. I heard it from the chief of police in Wyoming County, who's been helpful in giving out information over the long course of this whole thing I've been involved with looking into.
Sure.
And so he told me he had told me what story was on the record. Okay. And he told me that they tried to question Maurice, that they tried to question Alicia several times. They even brought in a lie detector, but the two of them were both so tanked every time they brought them in, they couldn't guarantee that the lie detector would, like they couldn't give a lie detector test to somebody who's under the influence.
Right. When, after the 26th, you're looking for Brian, and she says that she hasn't seen him in a couple days. Did you get back in contact with her? Did you feel like she was trying to look for him? Did she have any opinions on what happened to him at all? Anything at all?
Well, on on the 28th is the first time that I spoke to her after after he was supposed to have bought the truck.
Okay.
And then she tried to put on that she was so upset and didn't know where he was and what are we going to do, and anything that she can do to help out she would. Probably this went on for 2 or 3 weeks. She would call me every couple of days, and she was high and she was crying, and I finally had decided that I just didn't want to talk to her anymore. I couldn't take another minute of her cotton candy voice. And so I was just yesing and knowing her, and she was like, "Christine, what's wrong?" And I just said, "Alicia, I don't believe anything you're saying." And she said, her voice changed dramatically. She's like, "Christine, you don't think that I've had anything to do with this, do you?" And I was like, "I 100% believe that you had everything to do with this."
Is that, and how long after Brian disappeared did you tell that to her? How long after?
Probably 3. It was less than a month.
So sometime in August of 2011.
Yeah, it was less than a month. I just couldn't take her being in my life every day, calling every day. I couldn't take it anymore, so I was just done with her.
So I guess what we're saying is you didn't necessarily have any proof at that point. It was just an intuition, just a gut feeling.
No, but the thing is that Brian had been arrested a couple days before he went missing for a domestic dispute that they had. And so her pretending that she cared so much and she was so upset, and how was she ever going to live her life without him? And I didn't want to hear all that. I have my own child with him that I have to tell is missing, and she's never going to see her dad again. I don't care that you're not going to have your drug buddy anymore. Like that, I just didn't care anymore.
Right. How did you find out about this domestic violence call charge?
I didn't find out for a long time. I didn't find out for a long time. It was probably 2 years after this happened that the police officer that took the initial report told me, "You know, he was picked up a couple days before." And I was like, "No, I did not, but thank you for telling me." Because, again, he called me on those days, and he didn't say anything.
Right. He didn't tell you about it, and then when you talked to her, she didn't say anything about it either.
No, and not that they need to tell me what's going on in their life. It was just odd that he wouldn't say. It's just odd that he wouldn't say something.
Okay. So let me just go over for this for the listeners once again. You speak to him on the 26th, and it's very possible that that is the day that he, Maurice took him, Maurice's vehicle. Brian is the passenger. They went to Van or Wharton to see the stepmother. And then Maurice says that then they went to Lynco, Lynco, for West Virginia, and that Maurice dropped him off. That, from what you understand now, that all happened on the same day.
Yes.
All right. And then you, 27th, you're wondering, hey, where's Brian? He hasn't called me. He hasn't shown up. And then on the 28th is when you start calling around, and, of course, you talk to Alicia, and you continue to talk to her, and you think that she's giving you a BS story.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we have that all going on, and then, like you said, eventually with Alicia, you just grow tired of her because you don't believe that she's telling you the truth. Did she ever specifically in those conversations, as long as you could stand her, say anything about Maurice, if she believed him, anything like that?
She said she had no reason not to believe him, that they had been friends, which is, I guess, drug talk for he was my drug dealer, that they had been friends for a long while. So she didn't have any reason not to believe that Brian was let go in Lynco. But I asked her why would he even go to Lynco, and she didn't have an answer. So, and I wouldn't know. I don't know the area at all or the people, so I wouldn't have any idea.
Okay. Did you talk to Brian's stepmother around this time as well? Did she verify that he did go there and everything? Did you get that story straight from her?
I tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't call me back. When I would leave a message, she wouldn't call me back. We weren't friendly, so it wasn't surprising that she wouldn't call.
Even though her husband's son is missing, she wouldn't call you back.
Yeah, she's part of the reason Brian suspected her was because she had a habit of dating men who had money.
Mm-hmm.
And in West Virginia, I guess if you have a bank account, that means you have money. And so part of the reason he thought she didn't want to sell him the truck was because she wanted to sell it and get more money. That was his theory. That was Brian's theory.
Right.
So if I don't have anything to offer her in the way of money, so she's got to move on to people who do. Okay.
So this is the reason you think that she didn't call you back. She just didn't give a dang.
She didn't have a lot for Brian. She didn't care for him because he was close with David, her husband, and so she didn't want him around.
Right, and we have to remember Brian suspected possibly that the stepmother might have pushed his father's death along a little more quickly.
Sure, and I'm not sure if she knew that he thought that about her, but I have to believe that somebody saw him pulling hairs off of his father at his funeral. So. Okay.
All right, so you're not believing Alicia for obvious reasons, and once again we'll get into that a little in here in a bit. You know about this Maurice guy. Were you ever able to track him down to talk to him on the phone during that month, let's say to the end of August, ever?
No, I didn't know. Like, I knew he was a drug dealer, and that's not a world that I want to become a part of, and I wasn't sure how dangerous or not dangerous he was, so I just left him alone.
Okay. And then the stepmother's not calling you back. So you have this all going on. Who eventually did file the missing persons report?
Well, I was very surprised to find out that it was Alicia.
Okay. And when did she do that? Do you know the date or what?
I had thought, on the 28th she called and had him and filed the report. Then she got pulled in, but like I said, when they were, I was told she did it to keep her from having suspicion on her, but of course the first person they're going to look at is his girlfriend. And they did. But she never showed up sober to the police department, and they gave up trying after 3 tries.
Okay. So she is the one that, even though you're suspicious of her and eventually you don't want to talk to her anymore, there is proof that just on the 28th of July, 2011, and that's maybe where the date for this disappearance comes from, she did go down there and fill out the paperwork and sign it and say, yeah, my boyfriend is missing.
Yes, she did.
Okay. Where did she go? What county? What police department? What agency became responsible?
The Wyoming County Police Department.
All right, and that is where Oceana, West Virginia is?
Yes, that is.
Okay. Is Lincoln, West Virginia in the same county, or is it in a different county?
I really have no idea where Lincoln is at all.
Okay. All right.
Even looking at a map, I can't tell where it's at.
Okay, that's fine. All right, but I do understand that Wharton is in a different county. That's in Boone County?
That is true.
All right.
Yeah, Van and Wharton is in Boone County.
All right, so Brian, living in Oceana, West Virginia, is living in one county, but his stepmother, where his father was until he just died, was in Boone County, a different county.
That's true.
All right.
Yeah,
so,
and if there's a sizable distance between them. I would.
Yeah. There is.
It's not a small trip to make from Wyoming County to Boone County.
Right. That's certainly true, and I will at least post a map so everybody can look at this. If you're listening right now, this episode's coming out on what would it be on June
the 26th.
June 26th, 2020 is when this episode is playing. We're doing this interview on June 22nd, 2020, but by the time this airs, I will have posted at least one map regarding some of these locations. All right, so what does the Wyoming County Sheriff's Office do? That you said they tried to talk to, they tried to give lie detector tests, they talked to Alicia, they talked to Maurice. Anything else?
They did. I think that they spoke to his stepmom, who confirmed that they did show up at her house.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was just by telephone. She didn't have to go into the police department or anything. They did call me.
Okay.
Because I'm the ex-wife. I'm an obvious suspect. That's cool.
Okay.
I mean, I could account for my whereabouts, so that I was waiting for him. There was no reason for me to go find him. So that was just a quick phone call with a few questions and to verify my whereabouts. I guess they called his mom. She went into Boone County when she found out he was missing, and she and the police officer who took the first report, I guess they went around to different places to try and talk to people. Specifically, Maurice, she told me just last night that she went there 2 or 3 times to try and talk to him, but he wouldn't come out of his house to talk to her.
Okay. And this was, once again, in those days and weeks after Brian disappeared.
Yes, and at the time, and I don't know if you want to bring this up now or not, but at the time there were several missing people from the area. And so there were vigils being held, and there were searches being held on a couple of the mountains and down by the New River. And so she went in to try and take part in that and maybe try to find Brian herself and to pick up Brian's things from Alicia's, because Alicia told her she didn't want his stuff anymore.
Okay. Yes, and yes, those other disappearances and unsolved murders are certainly a part of this episode for sure. In fact, by the time we're talking about this in my lead up to this interview, I will have mentioned those other people, Christine, for sure. All right. So we have the police looking into this. Maurice is sticking to his story. Alicia is sticking to her story. The stepmother is sticking to her story. Not only is Brian missing, but the money is missing.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let's now move on to this. They tried to give the lie detector test, not successful. Why am I talking to you today? How is it that you got involved? And how much did you, how soon did you start looking into this yourself, etc.? How did you get involved?
Well, I immediately posted a page on Facebook called Help Us Find Brian David Cook. And I thought, at the time there was a forum site whose name I can't remember now, where people in West Virginia would go on and talk a bunch of crap about every rumor they had heard. And I thought, well, if I'll go on the forum site and read if anybody's talking about Brian. And surprisingly, nobody is talking about Brian. And it's an odd occurrence because they live through the rumor mill there. That's how information gets spread. It's not through the newspaper or the radio. It's so-and-so heard this, and everybody should have been talking, and nobody was talking. So that was sort of weird for me. And so I started this page hoping that somebody who maybe knew something but was afraid to come forward would say something. And also, I sort of needed a place to go and put my own thoughts about him. Like, I started thinking, if something happens to me, I want my daughter to have a place where she can go and read about what's been happening in her dad's case while she was young. And so I started this page, and some people started sending me messages that were really ugly, like really, really ugly, like he deserved what he got.
Okay.
He's a no good junkie. That sort of fueled this. It made me angry, really, because I know he was a junkie. I don't need to be reminded of that, but he was so much more also. It wasn't the only thing he was. And so I was just determined to try and find out as much as possible. But Brian had always told me not to believe anything that anybody up there said, and only half of what I could see. And so it's hard because everybody in Boone County is related to each other somehow. In my mind, there's like 10 families, and all of them have people that are married to each other in some way, shape, or form. And they all know the connections, and I don't know the connections. And so I don't want to ruffle any feathers and get on the wrong side of things. So I was very careful about who I talked to and what I talked to them about, since I didn't have the in on what was going on. And so little by little, I just would get pieces of information. Sometimes it was a message on there. Sometimes it was something his mom would say that happened when she visited. Sometimes it was this police chief who I would ask questions of when I finally had the courage to hear the answers. Just little by little, some of his I became friends with some of his cousins on Facebook who I thought were sober, and for the most part, most of the ones I spoke to are. And so little by little, they would tell me what they heard or what they had seen, or I don't know. I don't know. Things just trickle in, and since they're coming to me, I felt a responsibility to try and put the pieces together.
Okay. All right. Great. And you've been doing that for almost 9 years now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I can ask you, how many times have you personally gone to this area? You do not live in West Virginia. I'm not going to say where you live now, but you do not live in West Virginia. How many times have you been there to talk to people or snoop around over the last 9 years?
None.
None.
I won't go.
Okay.
I won't go, and I won't go because it's a safety issue for me and my daughter.
Yeah.
I have anything that I have gotten from outside, and if I'll tell a little story if I can.
Go ahead.
The first time that Brian took me to West Virginia, we stopped in Beckley, which is like the largest town closest to where he grew up.
I know Beckley, West Virginia very well. Yes.
Okay, good. So we stopped in Beckley at the gas station there, and we would fill up with gas there, and then we would drive down Bolt Mountain and drive to where he was from. By the time we got to his grandmother's house, when we would visit, everybody in town knew we were there. And we hadn't called anybody or told anybody we were coming in except his father, who was a quiet man. And so if I were to show up in town, everybody in town would know I was there before I even got there. And I just don't. That's a creepy feeling for me, and I just don't want to be a part of that at all. So I have not gone. There were vigils and searches I wish that I had gone to be a part of. I also don't want to put my face to any names that people don't, if they don't already know who I am, I don't want them to know who I am. So I don't mind that they know my name. I'm not hard to find online either. It's not like I'm trying to be mysterious in any way. I just don't want to invite people into my life that could do any harm.
Okay. It makes a lot of sense. And I think it does, being that the way you've explained all of this so far in this area of West Virginia, I don't think anybody's going to blame you for not visiting that area over the last 9 years. That all makes a lot of sense. Okay.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's move on to this. Did Brian have a cell phone at the time? Do you know anything about his cell phone records and what they tell, what do they say about that day? If we're going to start using the 26th as the day of the disappearance, what do they say?
So he did have a cell phone. It's my understanding that his mom had him on her plan. It was either AT&T or Verizon at the moment. I can't remember. And she gave them, well, okay, so the police didn't ask anything about his cell phone or try to ping it and see where he was or anything. And cell phones at the time, I know it's hard to believe they haven't always existed in the same way that they do now, but they were very archaic at the time. We were still pressing 1 3 times to get the letter C for text messaging. So it wasn't the same as it is now.
But I'll help you along here. Did you get to see the records? Who was the last person they talked to? Where did the phone ping, etc.?
So I don't know that they ever found the phone.
Okay.
I'll say that. I do know they looked at the records and went to ping, but it was years after. It was years after that one of the state police troopers called me just to check a box and say that he had called to be sure that I wasn't the person And so when he called, he said that they were trying to get permission from Brian's mom to open up those records, and she gave permission. But I guess even with permission, the phone company they didn't allow the police to see the records or to ping, like, I don't know if it's a number, like an IP number. I don't know what it is. I have no idea. But at some level, the phone company stopped the police from looking any further.
That sounds very weird. I know the listener's going to be saying that right now. Usually phone companies are fairly forthcoming. Usually.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Here's the other thing. It could be that the police department in West Virginia didn't know the right question to ask. Because this is not the kind of thing they deal with on a regular basis. And so I want to give them the benefit of the doubt for thinking about it, but they may not have asked. You know, if you call the phone company, you're going to get a tech person, and if you're not tech savvy, you don't even know enough to ask what you're asking. So I don't know if there was maybe a miscommunication. I don't know. I don't know what could have stopped it. I don't want to make a guess as to what stopped it, but on some level, they were not able to get that information.
Okay. I guess the question I wanted to ask, if Brian was on his mother's plan, should she have not automatically had access to the phone records? So I think she could have accessed the records online through her computer, which I think she did. I think there was a printout of calls. Okay. But I can't say for sure because nobody spoke to me about any of that. Just that they were working on it. Even though you spoke to Brian's mother in those days and weeks after he disappeared, she never brought that up.
No, and she was dealing with her own grief in her own way, and there were large pockets of time where we didn't speak to each other at all, not out of anger or not because we were upset with each other, not any having to do with that, just that we were stuck with our own grief and couldn't really reach out.
But to this day, she has never told you, and is his mother even still alive? I don't even know.
She is.
Okay.
She is still alive.
All right,
yes.
But to this day, she has never said, I finally looked at those records from when Brian disappeared, and here's what they say. This is who he texted last. This is who he called last. That's never happened.
No, and I think the last time that she and I spoke about this at all, it was that she gave permission for the police to look. But that she herself did not look. If I remember correctly, I don't want to speak for her, but if I remember correctly, that's what happened. That she didn't look, but that she gave them permission. She signed some piece of paper saying that they could look. Okay,
well, just put it this way then. To your knowledge, she, even though she would probably have had access to the records because he was on her plan, to your knowledge, she never looked at the records herself, to your knowledge.
That's correct. Yes, to my knowledge.
Okay, so maybe, those records have to be out there somewhere. I know it's been 9 years, but sometimes those things never get erased. So maybe there is a record still out there somewhere, and that might be something that probably, Christine, you need to work on a little bit. And I should also tell you, once again, publicly, that most of the guests that I have on the program do have access to phone records. Not all of them. Surely not all of them. But maybe 75%. So it's as long as it's a disappearance that happened in the cell phone era, that is.
Right. Yeah.
So it would not be unusual for, your an ex-wife or a mother to have access to those records. So if the police got them, I think that after 9 years, they should be willing to, give them up if they got them.
Yes, I agree. I'll be honest, it is something that has completely gone under my radar, or I would have asked for it by now. But it is something that I can ask about.
Okay.
And I will.
I think it's a definite big to-do to put on the to-do list. Okay. So we just have no idea. All we know is, of course, at that point early on, that we don't know what the cell phone records say. All we know is that Maurice took him to the stepmother and then allegedly dropped him off at this post office, and that was that.
Yes.
Okay. let's move on to this, and this is kind of where we're going to start maybe going in a different direction. Let's talk about this alleged sighting that, to just set it up, there's a convenience store, not in Lincoln, but somewhere else, that a person came forward allegedly seeing. Brian, why don't you tell the listeners about that? First of all, your initial reactions when you found out about it, and then we'll go further from there.
Okay. I heard a story. I can't even recall from where.
Mm-hmm.
That Brian had gone into a miner's market, and that the girl behind the counter knew who he was and said he looked really rough and was asking for help. And so she went to the back room to get the cordless phone. And when she came out, she was making a call to the police. She saw Brian being carried off by two guys and put into a black vehicle. And the only thing that she could say about the two guys was that they had barbed wire tattoos on their forearm, on their biceps.
Mm-hmm.
I was told that she said that he looked rough, I assumed she meant drugged out or drunk.
Okay.
But I have since come to believe that meant something different.
Okay. Now, we should state something. Maurice is black?
Yes,
Maurice
is black.
The guy that allegedly was driving him around that day is black, but these two guys that she saw were white.
That's correct.
Okay. At the time, being that you knew about the Maurice story, at the time when you heard the story, did you think this was true, or did you think this was just somebody telling a story, as often happens in disappearances?
I like to think everything that somebody tells me is true. That's where my head is always at.
Mm-hmm.
I'll believe it's true because if I believe it's true, I will remember it. If I think it's not true, I'll forget about it. And I'm trying not to forget about pieces of things that come in because I'm trying to put this puzzle together. So I wanted to believe that it was true because then it would mean, that he lived a little longer past where I thought he might have lived.
Okay. This miner's market, in what town is it?
I believe it's Wharton.
All right, so it's up in that Wharton Van area where the stepmother lived. That's
correct.
Up in Boone County and not Wyoming County where Oceana is.
That's correct.
Okay. So and it's not near Lincoln, West Virginia either.
No, it's nowhere near Lincoln.
Okay, so we have the sighting, alleged sighting, could be on the day that Brian disappeared, that he's seen not with one black guy, he's seen with two white guys, not in Lincoln, but somebody totally different, somewhere totally different during the day. Do you know if this clerk ended up completing the call to the police? Do you know anything about that?
No, after that story, I don't know who she is. I don't know who worked at that. I don't know anything else pertaining to that woman at all.
Okay.
Unfortunately, or what happened as a result. I do know that the state police have two to three officers max in each county.
Yeah.
And so if they didn't think it was that big of a deal, it wouldn't have been a top priority to respond to.
Right. We have to remember, yes, in this part of West Virginia, these towns are very small. They don't have their local police departments, and they rely on the state police for enforcing the laws in that area.
That's true.
Right, and it's not like you said, it's maybe two or three state police per county, which probably living in a city like I do in Pinellas County, Florida, only having two cops for a whole county sounds crazy. But I live in an urban area. We have Clearwater Police, we have Largo Police, we have Pinellas Sheriff's Sheriff's Office, everything. Okay,
right. All
right. We just have to maybe explain that. So you have this story, and once again, can you remember how you even heard about it?
No, I have notes, but I would have to go back and I don't know where I heard I heard about it. Somebody told somebody, and they told me.
Okay, and do you remember how long after Brian disappeared that you found this out? Was it, do you think, 2011, 2012?
That piece of information was like 5 years in the making. I probably didn't get that. I probably got that in the last 3 years.
Wow. All right, so it was quite a while. So, not sure what to make of that. We have a principle on Unfound. The longer it takes for a story to get out about a disappearance, the less likely it's true, but we may come back to that in a bit, and maybe there was more truth to that story than we realized. Okay.
Sure.
Let's move on to this. You had a counselor story. Can you pass that along about Brian's disappearance?
So, not very long ago, just before you and I met the first time on the phone,
okay,
someone came forward who said that she thinks that she has been hearing parts of the story about how Brian died, but she isn't quite sure, and she wonders if I can tell her anything about the story. And I'm loath to tell people in West Virginia what I know about the case, because I don't want them fishing for information and then making it more difficult should the police ever decide they want to get back involved in this case. So I didn't tell her the complete story. What I told her was the story about the miners market.
Right.
And she's a talker, like I'm a talker, and she shut up very quickly after I told her that story, and then said, I've got to go, put my kids, whatever, and I'll get back to you. And I just thought, well, I'll never hear from her again, so whatever. So a few days went by, and I got curious about her, and I messaged her back and said, hey, have you had any time to think about whether or not you think this could be Brian's story? And she said that it's been hard for her to hear what I had to say because something about the story triggers a truth in her life she doesn't want to face. And that is that someone she loves and knows was involved in the disappearance of Brian.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, do you, let me ask you this, being that she is some type of counselor, do you believe that she might have found this out through private means? So, like patient, doctor-patient confidentiality?
I don't think that there's doctor-patient confidentiality, but I definitely think there's probably like group, like AA or NA group. I think it might have been something through there.
Okay.
Clearly, they're not supposed to talk about those things, and I appreciate that she broke the silence to try and figure this out, because it also affects her family.
Okay. Do you continue to talk to this person?
Oh gosh, I haven't quit talking to her since we met.
Okay.
On the phone.
All right,
we talk.
All right, we're not using.
We talk a lot.
Yeah, we're not using this person's name.
No.
All right, and so what it did, though, you heard about this story, but what you're saying is this person gave more credibility to the miners market story, right?
Yes, she did, because she knows all the families that live there. And in talking to her and both of us asking questions back and forth, we were able to piece a lot of things together. One is that she knows a group of guys who all have barbed wire tattoos on their biceps. And so she was able to legitimize that. The other is that she knows that one of them lived very closely behind the miners market.
Right.
And
we're certainly going to get to that. Sure. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. So this person might have known something and didn't realize that she knew something. Kind of wasn't sure, and then you saying something to her and her own experience, kind of it all came together. All right, we're going to come back to that. Now, we talked about Maurice. We have his story that he just dropped Brian off. I think a lot of people, even just on its face, are going to be suspicious of that, because we have to remember that Brian had $15,000, was it, on him?
He had it in a lockbox. He owed the IRS money, and if he had put it in a bank under his name, they would have taken it.
Okay.
and he didn't want them to take it, so he bought a lockbox and thought that he would be safe carrying that around.
Okay, and he was going to use that money to buy that truck, but he wasn't able to buy it from his stepmother because she says that he was too high or drunk or whatever to drive it away.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, that story. What went on with Maurice after this all happened? You told me that he left the area for a while, then came back. What went on?
I guess he has family in Alabama. I guess the police chief at the time in Wyoming County took Brian's mom over to Maurice's house, and like I said, he wouldn't come out and speak to her. The police are 100%, like 99.999% that Maurice had something to do with Brian's disappearance. In fact, the two officers I've spoken to said they would stake their life on it.
Okay.
So he also does not have a job, is not receiving welfare in any way, shape, or form, and
Is it the belief that he is a drug dealer? Is it a belief that he is a drug dealer?
It is a belief that he's a drug dealer.
Okay.
And just after Brian disappeared, he bought new mud tires for his truck, an ATV, and took numerous family members down to Alabama and paid for their hotel stay, which he would not have had the money to do, although a drug dealer, apparently he was using as much as he was buying, so he wouldn't have had the extra money to do that just on a whim.
How did you find out about this?
It wasn't something he had done before. That was the police chief and Brian's mother told me they saw the new stuff in his yard.
Okay. And you're thinking this is right after Brian,
when they brought him in.
And you're thinking this is right after Brian disappeared.
Yes, right after Brian disappeared. It wasn't 2 days his mother was there to pick up all of his things, and so she went over there in the week or so following. And he just had stuff that he hadn't had when the police chief first questioned him. And so they brought him in and questioned him again and asked him about those things, and he didn't have an answer.
Okay, so he's driving Brian around with this money. Brian disappears, and then suddenly it seems like Maurice comes into money after that.
Yes.
This money just seemingly popped up out of nowhere.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, now I think we're slowly getting closer and closer to maybe an alternative story about what happened that day. When was the first time that you heard the name Chad Kuhn, Kuhn? When was the first time you heard his name?
I would say that was less than a year and a half ago. Well, okay, that's not true. I had heard the name before because Brian had grown up with him, and so I knew the name. But in relation to this case, I only heard it about a year and a half ago.
All right, so Brian and Chad about the same age, like went to school together or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have like a junior and a senior high school, and it's all on the same land.
Okay.
So families are, and also Brian has a cousin whose father married into Chad's family. And so on Sundays, they share a grandmother. And so on Sundays, their grandmother would cook for everybody who wanted to come out and hang out. And so they grew up together, just hanging out there as cousins would.
When you were married to Brian, did Chad's name ever come up?
No. Well, yes, that's when Chad's name came up, as the fact that they went to school together. They played, like I would look at pictures and I would see that they both had their football uniforms on. They were playing together. He would tell stories about how they would fill his mom's pantyhose up with rocks and throw them up in the air so the bats would crash into the rocks, and just things that boys do when they're growing up. Okay,
so until, like you said, a year and a half ago, you were under the impression that Chad and Brian were friends.
Yes.
Okay. Then a year and a half ago, and I already told the listeners, you and I have been talking since sometime in 2018. And so this would have been after you and I originally started talking that Chad's name came up. Why did it come up? How did it come up? Please explain to the listeners what happened.
So I was told by the person who's been sharing information with me for the last couple of years that Chad had a bonfire, and he was spouting off about all the bad things he had gotten away with. And at the bonfire, he was drunk or high or both, and his wife was trying to shut him up so that the people who were there wouldn't start talking about what he was saying. And one of the things that somebody heard was that he was related to Brian going missing, that there was not exactly what he had done, just that he was somehow involved. And so I started asking Brian's cousins that I was friendly with if they knew about Chad, and they said what we know about him is that he's a drug addict. He goes to jail like every other week for one thing or another, and he thinks the law can't touch him. And so then I spoke to one of Brian's cousins who I even sent her money when she needed help one time, and clothes when she didn't have any for her son to wear. I thought she was friendly. I thought we were friends, but it turns out that Chad is her first cousin, and she has known the entire time what had happened, and didn't share that with me, and so we're no longer in contact. Clearly, I wouldn't speak to her. But as it turns out, that one of the cousins that they share, this one I don't talk to anymore, and one that I do talk to now, said that I asked her one time, have you heard any stories about what happened? And she said, oh, you mean about Chad doing it? And I said, sure, that story. Tell me that story. And she said, oh, yeah, everybody talks about how Chad's responsible for it. So
it's somehow you didn't, even though you were working. So even though you were working on it for all this time, it took until 2018 or almost maybe even 2019 for his name to come up.
Right, because nobody wanted to tell his wife, his ex-wife. Nobody wanted to tell me because I'm an outsider.
Okay. All right. So he's out there spouting off allegedly that he had something to do with Brian's disappearance.
Sure, and I remember when you and I talked about it before, you thought differently.
Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot of stories.
Because why would somebody be spouting off? Right, I get it.
Right.
I get it.
Right, okay. And then this would fly in contrast. Well, this would be something different than the story that Maurice has been telling.
Yes.
Okay, to your knowledge, do Maurice and Chad know each other?
Yes, very well. Chad helps to move product for Maurice, and he also buys from Maurice.
Okay. Regarding Chad Kuhn, did you get anything specifically? Now, the listeners should know that I've had a chance to talk to somebody that's about as descriptive as I'm going to get, who I got to talk to recently. Christine made it possible for me to talk to this person, and I will be telling my conversation with this person after. But there is a particular scenario that you've heard about, Christine, regarding what might have actually happened that July 26th. Of course, that Maurice didn't take Brian to this post office. He actually took him to Chad's house, right?
Yes, that's the newest iteration of this.
Okay.
Of this case.
All right. And where does Chad live?
Behind the miners' market in Wharton.
Where allegedly this clerk saw Brian come in there around that time looking for help.
Yes.
Okay. And so you're saying that Chad lives right in that little town, maybe a block away from the market?
He did at the time that Brian went missing.
Wow. Okay, so maybe there is something to this. And what do you think the motive could have been in this, for all of this?
I 100% believe it was the money that he had in his lockbox.
The $15,000.
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that lockbox, because even though Brian is still missing in 2020, the money is still missing, but the lockbox was found. Why don't you tell the listeners about that?
Oh, I think the first time that you and I spoke, we had talked about the fact that there had been a truck fire.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I didn't have a lot of the answers to questions you had that were very brilliant questions, but I just didn't have them.
Oh, well, thanks.
But they were questions I wish in my grief I could have thought to ask at the time I got the information, but I just wasn't there. But there was somebody had found a truck that was on fire. I have received information. I don't know all of this. The entire case is alleged. Just going to say alleged because I don't have any proof. But the truck, I was told, belonged to Maurice, and the lockbox was found in that truck. And the reason people use lockboxes is to keep things safe. Mm-hmm. So I don't know why they thought putting the car on fire was going to do something to the lockbox, but it didn't. And the key to the lockbox was in the lockbox.
Do you know where this truck was found?
I don't know where the truck was found. I was told where it was found, but I don't know the area, and so that information didn't stick to my brain. Okay.
So you're saying at some point after Brian disappeared, there was a burned truck, and a lockbox was in it. And do you believe it was the lockbox that Brian would have had with him on the day that he disappeared?
Yes, and the police believe that as well.
Okay. And the key was inside it?
Yes. There were two keys to the lockbox.
Mm-hmm.
Alicia had one key and Brian had the other. And when we got Brian's stuff back from his mother, his key was in his things.
So there's only one other key, and that could have been Alicia's key.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting. Okay. All right. We have to remember that going back to when we talked about Alicia, that you were suspicious of her from very early on, within a month.
Yeah, I think anybody who's that cotton candy sweet has something to hide.
All right. It's not proof, but you just said that when in talking to her, it wasn't making a lot of sense. She was already acting like Brian was gone and everything else.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true.
And then you find this lockbox, and you find Brian's key in his stuff, but there's another key in this lockbox, and there's only two keys, so that must be Alicia's key.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I do have in my notes, though, that the investigator said that this story isn't true.
Yes. I guess when the local, so there was a time where the case moved.
Mm-hmm.
because it took place in where he lived in Oceana, but it took place in Boone County. They moved the case to Boone County, and it was like starting it all over again because the Boone County police did not necessarily believe the same things that the Oceana police had found out. And so they pretty much began the investigation from the beginning again. And although the notes for the case are still all in one file, it's like the case from Oceana didn't exist.
Okay.
And so the investigators in Boone County said that truck incident was not something that happened. But the investigator in Oceana says that the lockbox is still in evidence. And so I don't really know what to believe.
Okay. We have to remember, once again, Oceana, West Virginia is in Wyoming County, where Brian lived. Boone County is where Wharton and Van, West Virginia are, and that's where the miners' market is.
True.
All right. And do you believe And why do you think it got transferred from Wyoming to Boone County? On the strength of this Chad Coon story, or what?
Because the last place they can definitively say Brian was at his stepmother's house.
All right, not Linco, West Virginia. County. Not Linco, but in up at his stepmother's. Okay. So eventually,
yes.
Do you remember when that was that it got transferred from Wyoming to Boone County?
I don't know the date, no, but it wasn't very long after the initial investigation. I think Oceana had the case for just a few, like less than 5 months, and then it transferred.
Okay. So where this all boils down to is Wyoming County. They believe that the truck and this lockbox have something to do with Brian's disappearance, but Boone County isn't as convinced.
That's true. They couldn't put the pieces together, so they just ignored it.
All right. Have you ever been told whose truck this was?
No. I've been told it was Maurice's. I will say that. I've been told it's Maurice's, but I have no proof that it is.
Was that somebody in the police department that told you that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, you'd think that would be easy to do. I mean, you burn a truck, you could still get serial numbers or
the VIN.
The VIN off. There's several.
The tag was still on it. There's any number of things they could have done to further that part of the investigation, but I don't know that they were done. I'm not going to say they weren't because I wasn't there, but I have never heard anything since, and I've asked a lot of questions. Okay, but the way we are on June 22nd, 2020, is you believe that lockbox is Brian's? Yes, 100%. Okay. So he disappears, and somehow the lockbox, empty, shows up with a key in it. It would have to be Alicia's key, and it's still a big question mark all these years later. Okay. And we have to remember Maurice, if it was Maurice's truck, he ended up getting, I guess, tires for his other vehicle and treating all his family and everything else after Brian disappeared. So we have Maurice, who was allegedly driving. I think we do believe he was driving Brian around that day. It's just not sure. We're just not sure where Brian ended up, whether at the post office or at Chad's house, due to the money. Of course, talked about Chad, a relatively new member into this disappearance from just a year and a half ago. He's spouting off about what he did to certain people, and we'll talk about those other certain people here in a bit. But we can't forget about Alicia. She was asked about it by the police, it's my understanding. But once again, when she's questioned by the police, she's regularly too high to make sense. Mm-hmm. And so everything that comes out of her mouth is very gibberish, and she's got the act down 100%. Okay. How close were her and Maurice? I don't know what their affiliation was before Brian became part of her life. I would expect that she told Brian they were friends, and to be honest, it's the only reason I can see Brian going anywhere with Maurice. Okay, so your belief is that Alicia was first friends with Maurice, and then Brian came in afterwards. It wasn't like Brian and Maurice were friends, and then Brian introduced Maurice to Alicia. Right. It's my understanding that she introduced Maurice to him, and it's because the way that I know for sure that that's the case is because Brian didn't. He never had any dealings in Wyoming County whatsoever until he met Alicia, and when he met Alicia, he had met Maurice very shortly after. And they were not friends. There was no reason other than the fact that Maurice had a car and was willing to take him that Brian would go with him. Okay. Alicia and Chad Coon, friends? I'm guessing they knew each other at least? I think Alicia must have known him because he and Maurice do so much business together, so I'm going to guess they knew each other. Okay. Or at least had met. It might be that she and Maurice were talking about Chad, and Brian was like, hey, that's Chad Coon, and I went to school with him, and I know him. So maybe, I don't know. It's a small world up there. Right. Now, you did mention that if this new thing is true, that news story is true, and once again, after this interview, I'm going to be talking about some details of that
may make this Chad Kuhn story very real, that Maurice dropped Brian off at Chad's and did not drop him off at the post office, and the money was the thing that caused all of this. We have to remember there were two guys that, if we're to believe the story, that Brian showed up at the miners' mark and then two guys dragged him back out. Do you have an idea of who these two guys might be? Could one of them have been Chad, or do you think that, given the descriptions, that it was two other men?
Given the description, I think one of them, I think it was two other people.
Do you know their names?
I think one of them I know, yes, I know their names. I think, I'm not sure I want to give them.
Okay, that's fine. But were they friends of Chad's? I mean, is it believable that...
They all grew up together. They were all friends, even Brian. They were all friends even with Brian.
All right, so these two guys, not only was Brian friends with Chad, but he would have been friends from going way back with these two guys as well.
Yeah, he would have grown up with them in school and in sports.
That has to be tough. Once again, this is just a theory. I think there is some validity to it, but it has to be tough for you, Christine, to hear this, that these guys that Brian knew, that he was friends with, could be responsible for his disappearance.
Well, look, Brian grew up there, and I won't say that he was the smartest bulb in the box, but he had a sense about people, and the only way this could have happened is from people that he knew. He would not have trusted people he didn't know. And so there's drunk or not drunk, drugged up or not drugged up. He was always somebody who could sense people, and he would never have gone if he had thought for a minute that he was in any danger. Okay.
Now, probably the biggest development recently, we're talking about Chad Kuhn, and we're going to talk about him in a second, but the listeners should know, where's Chad Kuhn now?
Dead and buried.
What happened? When did this happen?
On my birthday, the greatest gift ever, I got a message from someone that said he had died of an overdose.
And this was just recently. Was this in May 2020?
Yeah, May 24th. Yep.
So about a month ago, Chad Kuhn, who we've been talking about in this disappearance, a guy's name that popped up within the last 2 years, him ranting about how he did this to Brian and other people, and we're going to talk about those other people in a second. Somebody that Brian grew up with, this guy overdosed about a month ago.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. So, but to your knowledge, is Maurice, Alicia, and these other men that you won't name, and that's fine, are they all still alive to your knowledge?
They are still alive, yes.
Okay. Now, one other thing that, and I will go over this after this interview, but I just wanted to ask you this. Is it true that Chad's sister ended up marrying a police officer that worked on Brian's disappearance?
It is the most recent news that I have been given. I haven't been able to substantiate it. Mm-hmm. I haven't looked at any public records to see if that's true, but it is the most recent news that's come in is that the officer that I was told to speak with if I ever had information about the case is now married to Chad's sister.
And they got married after Brian disappeared?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. All right, I will have to look into that, but that was something that did come up in my conversation with this other person that you wanted me to talk to. All right, and we do know the officer's name, and we're not going to use his name. Okay.
That's great.
Okay. Now, we've talked a couple times about how Chad was allegedly somewhere at some point after Brian disappeared, ranting, drunk, high, talking about all of these people that he had done something to. Now, the listeners need to know. Listeners need to know that during the summer of 2011, and this is all in that area, there were these things that went on. Brian disappeared late July of 2011. Sherry Myers, who is still missing to this day, disappeared in August of 2011. And
That's true.
and there are 2 unsolved murders in that same area from 2011 occurring all in that very small area during that summer. Rachel Toller, her remains were found chopped up in a cemetery in that area. And Chester Stewart, I've had a chance to talk to his mother just again recently. He was found murdered. Somebody had drowned him in a swimming pool. They had put a cement block or something and put him in a swimming pool, and he drowned. These were all
they tied cement blocks to all of his appendages.
Yes, okay. And so this all happened in a very small time frame of maybe a month during the summer of 2011 in the Oceana, Wharton, Lincoln, Van, West Virginia area.
Yes.
And Sherry Myers, I mean, she was last seen in Oceana, which is where Brian lived.
That's true.
Do you happen to know if Brian ever knew any of these people?
I don't know if he knew any of these people. By this time, our circles were not. He was the only person in his circle that I knew.
Okay.
Other than his family members, and he wasn't very much in touch with them at all. So besides he and Alicia, I don't know that he knew these people. They weren't names that came up as childhood friends when we talked about things. But it's very possible if they were in the drug scene that he would have come upon them at some point.
Okay. So he never specifically mentioned Sherry or Rachel or Chester?
No, he didn't.
Once again, to you. All right.
No, but at the time that went on, the police were convinced that he was part of a ring of disappearances.
Mm-hmm.
They got the FBI involved for a short period of time, who said that not all of them were connected, and so they were going back to the local level.
Okay. All right, and a couple other names. These are not people we're missing, but at least in Chester Stewart's murder, had you ever heard of the name Brad Shepard or Greg Lucian in connection to Brian's disappearance at all?
No, I had not.
Okay. And I think I've already told you that in talking to Chester Stewart's mother, Billy, I had mentioned to her the name Chad Kuhn. She had never heard of him before. All right.
Okay. Yeah,
so,
you did mention that.
Yeah. So I just think it's interesting that if we're to believe Chad, and I think there is enough information, at least circumstantial, to think that he had something to do with Brian's disappearance. If Chad is going to say that he was involved in other things, well, these could be those other things, being that they happened right around the same time. Makes a lot of sense.
It's true.
Makes a lot of sense.
And they're the only names that have come up as being missing or murdered in any fashion. So,
yeah,
I agree. It's definitely worth having someone look into those.
Okay. Being that you've known about Chad Kuhn for almost 2 years now, have the police have told you that they've looked at Chad for these other disappearances and murders? Have they?
No.
They haven't told you that.
No, nobody in fact is looking at Chad for these for some reason. So,
okay. Okay. I am going to, in addition to relaying my conversation with this person that you wanted me to talk to, I'm also going to be talking a little bit more about these 3 other people, Sherry, Rachel, and Chester, just to give the listeners a little more background on them.
I'm so glad.
You know, of course, I have to do that. But being that it is in such a small area, you got to believe that they are all somewhat connected. And the truth is, like Brian, these people were all into drugs one way or the other, living very risky, high risk lifestyles. Okay. So this is where we sit, June 22nd, 2020. Does it feel like you're making some progress here, Christine, working on this as long as you've been doing?
I feel like that. I don't know if I have the truth, but here's what I feel like. I feel like all the pieces that I have been given now finally come together. So I feel like I have a whole picture now instead of just, holes in the picture. I don't know if I have everything right. I'm sure if Chad were alive, he could laugh right in my face for being so naive about some piece of information that I have wrong. But I feel like I have enough of the story to make my brain stop questioning what happened.
What's this been like for you? As you've said, you've never been to that area since this happened. I can understand those reasons. Nobody would surely blame you for that, given all these shady characters who are still out there. Chad's gone, but these other people still are out there. What's this been like for you? What's this been like for your daughter, who's now 20 years old?
Well, I don't say that I do things right very often with a lot of confidence, but when she was little and her dad was doing drugs, from the beginning I have told her the truth, and I have not stopped telling her the truth. And I think that was probably the best decision I've ever made. It's horrible to tell your kid bad things about their parents. I never framed him as a horrible drug-addicted piece of crap. Just that he was sick and that he loved her and he was trying to get well, and it's a very hard thing to get well from. And as the years go on, if she asks questions, I'm always very honest with her about it. In fact, last night I had to tell her the most recent news that's come out of this, and I had to ask her, which is the first time I've ever done it, if she wanted to hear it or not, because it's just that awful. And she was brave, and she said she had to know. And so she's not somebody who cries. She's tougher than I am in that department. She holds a lot of stuff in. And she absolutely fell apart last night when we were talking. So it's been hard. It's bad enough your dad goes missing than to find out he was murdered, and then in the fashion in which it happened. And to think that to you he was just this simple country guy who loved you like nobody's business, and that was his ending. She just said he didn't deserve it. That's all she said last night, was that he didn't deserve it. And so for her, it's just been, she's always wanted to know, and in her mind, she wants people to pay for it. The difference between her and I is that I know people are going to pay for it one way or the other, and really what I just want is for him to be found. It would be the end of life's work for me if I could tell her that her dad is resting next to her pawpaw. So I think then I could finally let this go and actually really take time to feel whatever it is I need to feel about it.
I should ask you this maybe about Chad Kuhn. Is there any proof that, being that Brian was in that general area all over again, once again living in Oceana, although Chad lived in a different place, is there any, it just seems odd to me that suddenly they would just run into each other after all those years. Are you more inclined to believe that maybe Brian had reestablished connections with Chad, and you just never came up in the discussions you had with him?
Yeah, I would be inclined to believe that Maurice said that that he had a contact in Boone County, and Brian asked who it was because he knows everybody. And probably he was surprised to find out that it was his lifelong acquaintance, at least friend. It wouldn't surprise me if they said, "Hey, while we're here, let's go stop at Chad's and see him." Or if Maurice said, "Hey, let's stop at Chad's, he wants to see you," none of that would surprise me at all. So,
okay. I guess what I'm saying is, being that you were keeping in contact with Brian, and like you said, you talked to him on the 26th. That it very well may be that's the disappearance date. He never said to you something like, "You know what? Remember Chad Kuhn? Remember way back in the day?"
No.
He never said, "I've reestablished. I've been talking to Chad Kuhn again. Here he lives right up the road," and that never came out.
No, and it wouldn't actually, because we didn't spend a lot of time before he went back to West Virginia talking about Chad Kuhn. I only remembered the name. It's the stupidest thing, but I only remembered the name because I thought that his last name was spelled Coon. And that's not it.
Right.
And so that's the only reason that I remembered his name over anybody else's that Brian could have told me about in his youth. It's just because I thought his name was spelled one way and it was spelled another.
Okay.
So he wouldn't have brought to my attention, he wouldn't have thought that I would remember any conversation about Chad at all.
Okay. I have to ask, how does your husband feel about this? You know, all this work that you've put into the
I'm so glad that you asked.
Well, I got to ask.
Yeah. I know a lot of people send me private messages when I post on Brian's page that I should be focused on my current marriage and not my past marriage, and that I should put all my effort into that. And Brian and my current husband met. Brian used to play with my son when he was little. They were not friendly. They did not like each other, but they were never, ever, ever, ever outwardly ugly to each other in front of my kids, or that would have stopped immediately. So my husband knew what he was getting into when he met me, and allows room for Brian in our relationship because Macy's here and he loves Macy. And so maybe he hasn't told me completely how he feels, but he leaves room for this to be a part of my life, and I consider that to be very respectful, and I appreciate it.
And he does have to realize that this isn't just an ex-husband. You have a child together, Macy. And
he does. Yeah,
right.
He really does.
Right. Okay.
He's nothing but supportive, and he said I couldn't. He knows that I still love Brian, and he thinks what he said to me is that I couldn't love him the way I love him if I didn't also still love Brian. So he doesn't take anything away from Macy and I about Brian. He's offered to help often. If we've needed help with anything, he offers to be a part of. He celebrates Brian's birthday with us by eating peanut butter pie every year.
Yum.
So it's not a taboo subject in our house.
Okay. I'm glad you have a supportive husband like that.
I'm glad also.
Yeah, not a lot of guys would be like that. You know, allowing that much room, you know, in a relationship, you know, for the ex-husband.
It's true.
Of course, this is unique
No,
circumstances.
I feel very lucky, and I'm glad that he knows how much I love him, and doesn't try to impose any kind of limits as far as Brian is concerned. It just wouldn't work out that way.
And what you're saying, I was thinking, we've had at least one other ex-wife on the program. I believe that was Christy. Her last name is not Morrow anymore because she got married again, but I know her as Christy Morrow. She was married to Travis Morrow, a disappearance we covered from, I think, Oklahoma of all places. And she was the guest for that episode. And she said about the same thing, you know, that her current husband just knows that's the way it is, you know, and that's...
Yeah, it's not like I put my foot down and said deal with it or
right.
not. It's just I can't let go until it's solved, and he knows that that's how my brain works, and so he just allows room for it, and it doesn't... He's off, you know, he's sitting in the living room right now. He hasn't come in and barged in or tried to interrupt or do anything in any way. Like, he's totally fine. He knew this was coming today. He said if I needed any support, he would come and sit with me through the whole interview. I think he's a really fantastic person. I'm so glad to have him.
Great. Do you have a Facebook page, website, anything like that set up for Brian?
I do, and it's on Facebook. It's called Help Us Find Brian David Cook. Mostly it's going to be people thinking I need to seek therapy because that's where I go to talk to Brian too, as if heaven has a Facebook.
Okay.
But sometimes when things happen in Macy's life, I just like to put it there so that there's some record of telling him what's going on.
Okay. All right. Say it again. Say the page again. What is the name again?
Help Us Find Brian David Cook.
Okay, great.
As it turns out, if somebody is looking for Brian David Cook through Google, there happened to be another guy, Brian David Cook, who went missing.
Yeah.
But was found.
Yeah.
So it's confusing.
Yeah. Yep. I've seen that. I did see that. Okay, we'll make sure we get the right one. Any last words before we complete this interview, Christine?
I don't think so. I just want to say that I appreciate anybody who's taken the time to listen, and I hope they realize that he was more than just his illness at the end of his life. He was a remarkable person, the hardest working man I've ever met, and a really amazing dad.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound.
I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much, Ed.
You're welcome.
And that was my interview with Christine Long, ex-wife of Brian Cook. I thank her for joining me and all of you on the program. As I stated in the interview, I've known Christine for about 2 years now. We started talking about Brian's disappearance back in 2018. Chad Coon's death a month ago opened up the opportunity to finally talk about Brian's case publicly with full transparency. As was mentioned in the interview, Christine put me in contact with a person who seemingly has credible knowledge of what happened the day Brian disappeared. This person knows this due to connections in the area, and Christine trusts this person, so I agreed to see what this person had to say. These are my notes from the conversation. I'm just going to go over the general story because getting into the real specifics of what allegedly happened that day could expose who the sources are for this information. This person knows someone who was allegedly there when Brian was killed. The story is that Maurice showed up with Brian. The people there were allegedly Chad, Maurice, and other people, including the 2 men Christine did not want to name during the interview. Chad immediately asked for the $15,000 Brian had in the lockbox. Brian wouldn't give it up. A fight ensued that eventually ended with Brian being clubbed to death. They all then went up into the mountains in Boone County to dispose of Brian. This person told me that the source of this information was there from the moment Brian got there until Brian was disposed of. This was clear. And those were my notes. I wish I could tell you more, but like I said, this person who came forward is adamant that the identities be concealed. And me saying any more than what I just said could reveal the source of this information. So, what do I make of it? What this person said certainly makes a lot of sense, mainly due to Brian's money never being found, and his lockbox being found in a burned-out truck that was allegedly owned by Maurice. Then you couple that with Chad spouting off about how he killed people. Sure, makes a lot of sense. The problem I have, though, and I asked this source very specifically, are you saying that the person you knew who was there that day never said anything about Brian escaping and them capturing him at the miners' market? This person said the source never said that. That is a big red flag in my book, because the source was allegedly there the whole time and would have seen Brian escape. Yet the source never brought it up. The other problem, and I think this is an even bigger one, this person didn't even find out about the source's story until very recently, even though this person was around at the source for many years. Moreover, the person found out about this story regarding Brian's murder from a third party and not from the source who was allegedly there that day. So, there's that. I think what I'm saying is I can certainly believe Maurice took Brian to Chad's, and Brian was murdered there. It makes a lot of sense, especially considering that Chad said he did it. But what I'm also saying is we don't need this source's words to believe it. In addition, due to there being holes in the source's recollection, we can certainly believe Brian was murdered that day, but not necessarily in the way the source described. Ultimately, with any information presented on Unfound, it's up to you to decide what you believe and don't believe. As for the other people who were either murdered or who disappeared that summer of 2011, Sherry Myers, Rachel Toller, and Chester Stewart, I have tried to find someone in Sherry's family to talk about all of this. I've been unsuccessful so far. However, as Christine said, Brian never mentioned Sherry, so we aren't sure if they knew each other or not. Regarding Rachel Toller, my assistant Emily had contact with someone in her family in 2018. Then that person blocked Emily for some reason. We are still unsure why that happened. Rachel's dismembered remains were found in a cemetery in the area where all this occurred. Brian never mentioned Rachel to Christine. Luckily, with Chester Stewart, we've had more success. I've spoken to his mother, Billy, twice now. Once in early 2019, then just recently, about a week ago. I told her about Chad Kuhn, but she insists the name is not familiar to her. Instead, Billy believes Brad Shepard and Greg Lucian are responsible for Chester's murder. He was found drowned in a pool of an abandoned house with cement blocks attached to his arms and legs. Like the other two, Brian never mentioned Chester to Christine. Yet, despite Brian never mentioning any of these people to Christine or seemingly anyone else, I'm not sure that matters. What matters is if Chad Kuhn can be connected to any of them, in some way, through drugs or money, or maybe just because Chad Kuhn felt like killing someone that day. Because I really can't see all these cases as being coincidences as to when and where they happened. This isn't the San Francisco Five, where those 5 young men disappeared in a city of millions over the course of 5 years. These are 4 people who disappeared or were murdered over the span of a month in a very sparsely populated area. And who knows? Maybe I've miscalculated this. Maybe Brian's disappearance isn't the tip of a tentacle. Maybe all 4 of these cases are the tips of the tentacles of an even larger octopus. I'll leave the rest of the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Dentzel, and you've been listening to Unfound.